What if love were a key, not to open doors, but to lock them from the inside? What if the person who says I take care of you is in fact silently deciding who you are allowed to be? What if the promise of protection were only the first step of a pack no one reads to the end? What if memory were not a safe place, but a narrow corridor where every recollection is rearranged until it looks like destiny? What if death were not an ending, but an old habit repeated gently, the way someone folds a sheet believing order can prevent loss? There are stories that begin as warmth, a welcoming look, a calming voice, a touch that says everything is fine now, and for a while it is. Because love has that power to push danger far away, to shrink the world to the size of an outstretched hand. But there are stories in which the outstretched hand does not offer only shelter, it offers direction, and before you realize it, you are already walking. What if the name someone gives you spoken with tenderness is the first layer of your disappearance? What if what seems like care is an old method, rehearsed, perfected in other lives, or in other versions of the same life? The place she went to was not marked on ordinary maps. It had the kind of existence that only becomes real once you arrive. A pale road, a silent valley, a small town that always seemed to hover on the edge of a permanent dusk, low houses, restrained gardens, windows that watched without curiosity, an air of waiting that was not anxiety, it was habit. And above all, a building at the edge of town, between trees and fog, not exactly a mansion, not exactly an estate, but something old enough to have learned how to breathe on its own. Dark roof tiles, solid walls, wide porches, and a sense that everything there had been built to last. That was where she entered for the first time, and where her name began to change. He did not call her by the name others used. Her legal name, the one on documents and invitations, seemed not to fit in his mouth. He looked at her with a care that felt like recognition, not merely attraction. A look that said finally without needing to say the word. And then he chose a name, a delicate nickname. Simple, seemingly innocent, a short sound easy to repeat. He said it with tenderness, as if offering it as an intimate gift. And for a while that was exactly how it felt. A gift, a kind of refuge within the refuge. Only later, much later, would she understand that the name was the first outline of a frame. The house smelled of old wood and dried lavender. There were too many books, too many rugs, too many heavy curtains. Everything was soft, silent, contained. Footsteps barely made a sound. The air seemed filtered through decades of secrets. Even the clock in the main room ticked quietly, as if it had learned not to disturb. In the first days, the romance seemed to grow like a plant in shade, slower, deeper, clinging to the little light that came in. He was gentle, attentive, careful. He never invaded, never demanded. He only suggested, offered, guided. The way he asked questions already carried the answer within them. The way he protected her already decided what she would be allowed to see. He said the world outside was too loud, too cruel, that she had always seemed out of place in it. That there in that house she could rest from the effort of being strong. She could be taken care of. She could be spared. And she believed him because there was an old exhaustion in her body, a desire to be held without having to explain herself, a hunger for belonging. And because he offered it the way someone offers a chair to the tired, with ease, with sweetness, as if it were obvious that this was where she belonged. The first sign that something did not fit did not come as a threat. It came as excessive delicacy. One morning she tried to open a hallway window to let the air in. The latch gave way, but the window did not open fully, as if some light force were holding it at the exact point allowed. She tried again, and the glass trembled with a thin, irritated sound. So she gave up. Minutes later, he appeared with a calm smile and said without accusation that the window was delicate, that it was better not to insist, that he would fix it later. He did not ask why she wanted to open it. That bothered her more than any prohibition. In the days that followed, she noticed small corrections in the environment. A book she had left out of place returned to the shelf without her noticing. A painting she had tilted to see better appeared straight again, as if the house refused to be touched. A rug always aligned, always at the same angle, as though geometry were a moral rule. And slowly that rigidity began to seep into her. She started folding clothes more carefully, storing objects with greater attention, lowering her voice without realizing it, as if the natural volume of life were improper in that place. At night, sleep came heavy, but not peaceful. There were recurring dreams, endless corridors, doors that opened into the same room, an invisible hand putting things back where they belonged. In some dreams, she tried to say her own name and no sound came out. In others, someone called her by the new name, and she answered before thinking. Act 1 truly begins when she finds, inside a drawer she does not remember opening, A set of old, yellowed labels, all bearing the same name, the name he had given her, repeated in different handwritings, as if many hands had written it over time. Beside the labels, a small photograph, a woman standing on the porch of the house, with the same tired gaze, the same shape of mouth, and an almost non-existent smile, holding, between her fingers, a label with that name, as if someone had been called that before. The photograph sat on the table for several long minutes, as if the wood itself needed to feel its weight before allowing it to be put away. She tried to analyze it coldly, like someone solving a simple puzzle, but her body reacted before her mind. There was a tightening in her stomach, a discomfort that came not only from what she saw, but from what she sensed. The feeling that the image was less a record of the past and more a mirror of a future already rehearsed. She put the photo back in the drawer, pushed it carefully all the way in and stood, still in front of the dresser, listening to the silence. It was a thick silence, but not an empty one. There was a presence in it that did not need footsteps to be felt. The house seemed to observe her attempt to pretend normalcy, as if waiting for her to accept the message without fully understanding it. For the rest of the day, she tried to stay busy. She walked through the rooms, reorganized small objects, read passages from books without truly absorbing them. The new name, the name he had given her, seemed to echo in different spaces even when no one spoke it. The sound lingered like a perfume that seeps in, and the more she tried to push it out of her awareness, the more familiar, comfortable, inevitable it became. When he arrived in the late afternoon, his presence brought the immediate peace it always did. It was as if her body had learned to relax in his proximity, as if the simple fact of him being there made any strangeness explainable. He approached slowly, touched her face gently, and said the new name with the same tenderness as always, and for a second she felt the urge to believe again. The romance deepened through simple gestures, silent dinners, walks along the porch as the fog rose from the valley, the way he draped a shawl over her shoulders when the air grew cold. There was beauty in the constant attention, a kind of care that seemed rare in the outside world. And that was why doubt hurt so much, because doubt did not deny love, it merely asked what exactly that love required. He spoke of the house as if it were a living body. He commented on how the corridors retained heat, how certain walls absorbed sound, how the floorboards responded better when not disturbed. His words were gentle, but they carried a strange conviction, as if he were not using metaphors but describing facts. One night, when the wind made the porch creak with slow regularity, he remarked, almost casually, that the place had protected people before, that there, no one needed to face what was outside, that when the house accepted someone, it became a perfect shelter. She asked what accepted meant. He smiled as someone who saw no danger in the question. He said it was hard to explain, that some people resisted rest, that some insisted on remaining restless, and that hurt them, that the house helped lift that burden, that with time everything fell into place. His smile was kind, but his words, even without threat, carried a terrifying idea. To fit in might mean losing one's edges. In the early hours of the morning, she woke to a low, repeated sound, like something gently tapping against wood. It came from somewhere inside the house, far enough to feel like a dream, close enough to keep her from falling back asleep. She got up slowly, left the bedroom, and walked down the corridor, guided by the feeling that the sound wanted to be found. The house was dark, but not completely. Dim light leaked from cracks, as if some doors were not fully closed. She passed one and smelled lavender more strongly, almost suffocating. The sound continued, rhythmic, patient. She went down the stairs and entered the main hall. The noise came from the sewing room, a space she rarely visited, filled with old fabrics, boxes, mannequins covered with sheets. The door was ajar, and a low light spilled into the hallway. When she pushed the door open, the sound stopped. The room was empty, but on the central table lay a piece of fabric spread out, as if someone had been working there moments before. Beside it, a measuring tape, pins, and labels. Several of them, yellowed, like the ones she had found in the drawer, with the same name, repeated. Only now there was a difference. Some of the labels were new, recent, with the name written in still dark ink, as if they had just been prepared. A chill ran down her spine. There was no one there, no plausible explanation for the scene, and yet everything was too organized to be a hallucination. She touched one of the new labels. The paper was firm, the ink not fully dry. That was when she noticed in the corner of the room a partially uncovered mannequin. The sheet that covered it had slipped, revealing an old, heavy dress of dark fabric with delicate details at the collar, a dress that did not look made for display, but for use. And attached to the neckline hung a label, the new name, her name, or the name they were trying to make hers. Act 1 closed there, with the sense that the romance was not merely romance, but preparation, that his care was not merely care, but method, and that the house was not waiting for her to live there, it was waiting for her to become something inside it. In the corridor behind her, a step sounded softly, not a hurried step. A step that seemed certain it would be heard. She did not turn immediately. Her first reaction was stillness, as if her body instinctively tried to deny the sound's existence. The step was not followed by another. There was only that single confirmation, a presence announced with delicacy, like someone knocking without hurry, certain the door would open. The smell of lavender inside the room seemed stronger than it should have been. It was not pleasant. It was a veil, an attempt to cover the house's real scent, old wood, stored fabric, ancient dust, and a metallic note that surfaced where the past lay more exposed. She held the label in her hands and, without thinking, placed it back on the table, as if the gesture could undo the scene. Then she took a deep breath and finally turned. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with the calm of someone who felt no guilt. The dim hallway light shaped his face in soft shadows, and when his eyes met hers, they showed no surprise. There was a kind of patient tenderness there, almost sad, as if he were watching a child insist on something unnecessary. He did not ask what she was doing there. He showed no irritation. He simply entered the room slowly, walking carefully so as not to make noise, and in that moment, that was more frightening than any aggression. He approached the table, touched one of the new labels with his fingertips, and the gesture was so natural it seemed part of a routine. The mansion remained silent, but she felt the silence had changed. It was no longer a pause, it was a vigil. He said, without direct words but with the weight of his presence, that it did not have to be frightening, that she was seeing signs of something larger than she could understand at the moment, that the house required certain care, certain preparations, and that she, being sensitive, being compatible, was beginning to be included. Compatible was the word that stuck in her mind. It was a cold, technical word, inappropriate for love, and yet he carried it with the same softness he carried affection, as if to him there were no contradiction. He guided her out of the sewing room with a light touch on her arm, like leading someone half asleep back to bed. The contact was almost imperceptible, but firm enough to impose direction. As they went up the stairs, she noticed details she had not before. Small marks on the banister, like old fingernails. The way certain steps creaked always in the same tone, almost musical, and the sense that the upstairs hallway felt narrower that night. When they reached the bedroom, he did not close the door completely. He left it resting in the smallest crack, too small to serve as ventilation, too large not to be intentional. He helped her lie down as if she were ill, and sat beside the bed for several long minutes, watching her with a protective calm. Then he said the new name. He said it as one calls someone back, as one reaffirms a bond, as one places a seal. And she realized, with a terror she could not yet name, that her old name was beginning to feel distant, not because she had forgotten it, but because inside that house the sound of her original name seemed to have nowhere to echo. The next morning, the sun rose timidly, filtered through the fog. She woke with the memory of the night as if it had been a dream, but her body contradicted that idea. There was real fatigue in her muscles, and a faint smell of lavender clinging to her hair, as if she had spent a long time in the room of fabrics. She went down for breakfast and found the house in perfect order as always. Nothing indicated the sewing room had been used at night. No labels in sight, no fabric laid out. It was as if the mansion had swallowed the episode and returned only what was strictly necessary, the emotional imprint. He was at the table, reading. When he saw her, he smiled serenely, and again he said the new name, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That was when she noticed something alarming. No one in town called her by her old name, not because they knew the new one, but because he always seemed to answer first. When someone addressed her, he completed it, corrected it, gently introduced the new name into the conversation, as if by habit. And over time, people repeated it, not out of malice, but out of ease. She began to feel her own identity being silently negotiated, reduced, renamed, fitted. The clues multiplied gradually, as if the mansion, sensing her awareness, decided to offer evidence instead of hiding. She found an old album on a low shelf among hardcover books. When she opened it, she saw photos of quiet gatherings, dinners, domestic scenes. Always the house in the background, always the porch, always the same fog. And on many pages, different women, but with something in common. All of them wore a dress similar to the one on the mannequin. And in some photos, down in the corner, labels hung like accidental details, with the same name, the same one. Each time she saw it, her heart tightened. It was as if the name were a thread running through decades, stitching different people into a single pattern. At the same time, the romance grew more intense. He seemed to sense the growing distance and answered it with more affection, more closeness, more promises. He talked about the future, about staying, about turning the house into a permanent home. The tenderness was real. But the purpose behind it now felt unavoidable, to make her accept without realizing. He spoke of the new name as if it were recognition, not imposition. He said some people carry names that don't represent them, that there are identities that don't fit the raw world and must be adjusted, that giving someone a new name was an act of welcome, almost of redemption. The words were sweet, but the subtext was clear. The old name was a mistake. The house reinforced that idea through small, invisible gestures, letters addressed with the new name, personal items reorganized under discrete labels. Even the bedroom mirror seemed to react differently depending on which name she used in her mind. With the old name, the reflection looked dull. With the new one, sharper, more integrated into the space. She tried to resist in quiet ways. She wrote her old name on a piece of paper and hid it inside a book. She whispered it before sleep like a private prayer. She tried to attach it to physical sensations, the shock of cold water, wind against her face, to anchor it in her body. But each attempt seemed to trigger a subtle response from the house, as if the environment patiently corrected the deviation. The nights grew denser. The dreams gained structure. They were no longer disconnected fragments, but organized sequences, her walking through the house in different dresses, each marked with the same label, her being called by the new name by voices with no faces, her trying to answer with the old name and waking before she could finish the word. When she woke, she felt a deep fatigue, as if she'd spent hours negotiating with herself. It was during one of those pre-dawn hours that she heard something different. Not footsteps, not creaks, but a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from inside the walls. A continuous murmur, like fabric being dragged slowly. It didn't seem accidental. It seemed like work, a process underway. She followed the sound to the oldest corridor in the house, the one she rarely walked. The walls there were thicker, the air colder. At the end of the corridor, she found a door she didn't remember seeing before. It wasn't locked, it wasn't hidden, it simply existed, discreet, as if it had always been waiting for that moment. When she opened it, she found a narrow space lined with shelves. On them, boxes arranged by size and color. On each box, a label, the same name, always the same, different handwriting, different eras, identical content. It was an archive, not only of objects, but of discarded identities. Inside one open box, she saw something that stole the air from her lungs for an instant. Old documents, photographs, small belongings. Everything belonging to a woman different from the first photograph, but with a life that looked disturbingly similar to her own. And among the papers, a folded document where that woman's old name had been crossed out and replaced with a new name in firm ink. Understanding landed like a silent blow. The name wasn't only hers, it never had been. It was a functional label, a designation for whoever filled that role in the house, a linguistic mold meant to erase differences to make replacement easier. She closed the box with extreme care, as if any abrupt movement might trigger something. When she stepped out of the archive, she realized the sound inside the walls had stopped. The house seemed satisfied, as if it had allowed the discovery because it believed that from then on, resistance would be useless. Act 2 moved toward a point of no return the moment she understood she wasn't merely being renamed, she was being prepared to disappear inside a name that wasn't hers, but belonged to all the others before her. And when she returned to the bedroom, she found a new dress laid carefully on the bed, the fabric still cold with the night air. At the collar, the label hung with perfect precision. The name was waiting. She didn't touch the dress that night. She stood in the doorway for a span of time she couldn't measure, watching the way the fabric seemed to drink in the little light available. The dress wasn't just clothing, it was a silent proposition, an invitation that needed no words because it already carried the expected answer. The entire house seemed arranged around that object, as if everything else were secondary scenery. She closed the bedroom door and backed away, sitting on the hallway floor with her spine against the cold wall. For the first time since she arrived, she felt something close to pure anger, unadorned. Not explosive anger, but dense, focused, lucid. An anger that didn't want to destroy, but to stop. The new name, the dress, the boxes, the archive, none of it was care. It was systematic substitution. And the tenderness wrapped around the process didn't make it any less violent. There, sitting on the floor, she became conscious of something essential. The house needed her to fall into rhythm. It needed her to accept the name, the dress, the role. Without that, the whole mechanism would remain incomplete. The mansion couldn't act alone. It depended on a final ascent, even if that ascent was wrung from exhaustion. She went back into the bedroom only when her body demanded rest. She slept little, in an uneasy state of vigilance. She dreamed of seams being undone, stitches pulled carefully, fabric returning to its raw state. In the dream, invisible hands tried to redo the work, but something resisted, not with force, but with a refusal to cooperate. The next morning, he appeared even more careful. His voice was low, patient. He didn't mention the dress. He didn't have to. The omission was strategic. He spoke about small things, the weather, the town, vague plans for the future. And in every sentence, the new name appeared naturally, as if it were already final. She answered little. She watched. Every gesture of his seemed designed to reduce tension, to soften the emotional space, to make resistance too tiring to keep. The house helped, offering physical comfort, perfect temperature, the right silence, food prepared with near ceremonial attentiveness. Everything conspired to make surrender appealing. But something in her had changed. She began to act in a minimal but decisive way. She didn't confront him, didn't argue. She simply stopped responding to the new name. She didn't correct him, didn't explain. She just didn't react. At first he repeated it, gently. Then he touched her arm to get her attention. The house seemed to adjust the lighting, the sound, as if trying to support the connection. But she remained still, present, whole, and silent. That refusal didn't cause an explosion. It caused unease. The following days grew stranger. The house seemed to lose some of its usual precision. Objects appeared slightly misaligned. The lavender scent became irregular, sometimes absent, sometimes overwhelming. The murmur inside the walls returned, but now with interruptions, as if the process were being restarted again and again. He began watching her more closely. There was love in his gaze, but also something new, uncertainty. For the first time, the method met a kind of resistance that didn't show up as conflict, but as the absence of cooperation, and that seemed to confuse him deeply. One cloudy afternoon, she went back to the old corridor and opened the archive door again, not with fear, but with decision. She pulled out one box, then another. In each one, similar stories, old names crossed out and replaced, letters cut short, photographs with restrained smiles. There were no monsters there, only repetition, only people who had yielded from exhaustion. She didn't take anything with her. She didn't need to. The strength was in recognition. That night, she spoke for the first time in days, not to him, but to the house. She said her old name out loud, steady, without anger, without pleading. The word echoed unevenly through the corridors, as if it couldn't find surfaces willing to receive it. Still, it remained. The effect wasn't immediate, but it was real. Something slipped out of order. The clock in the main room stopped for a few minutes. A painting fell without a sound. The house seemed to experience a brief loss of tuning. Act 2 neared its peak when she understood she didn't have to destroy the cycle. She only had to stop feeding it. And that the greatest act of rupture wasn't fleeing, but existing outside the role prepared for her. In the early hours when she woke, she found the dress folded differently, no longer displayed like an invitation, but put away in haste, like someone had temporarily given up insisting. And in the mirror, for the first time in a long while, the reflection offered only one face, hers, without overlays, without huge shadows. But she knew the final confrontation still hadn't happened. The confrontation didn't arrive as a direct threat, nor as a theatrical revelation. It came as a silence that lasted too long. A silence that didn't welcome, didn't protect, didn't watch. It simply waited. The house seemed suspended, as if all its mechanisms had been put on pause, awaiting a decision that could no longer be postponed. She felt it in her body before her mind could understand it. A low, constant tension, like electricity held in wires. The air was colder, the corridors longer. The house no longer corrected small deviations automatically. It let them exist, like something testing limits. He changed, not abruptly. There was no visible anger or desperation. There was a new restraint, tighter. The care became economical, the gestures less frequent. It was as if he were slowly withdrawing what he used to give in abundance, so the absence would produce the desired effect. Tenderness turned into a tool of scarcity. She saw the strategy with painful clarity. For years, perhaps decades, the method had worked because it offered more than it took. Now, faced with her silent refusal, it had to adapt. The house seemed to learn from him. Where there had been comfort, coldness appeared. Where there had been predictability, waiting appeared. Silence stopped feeling sheltering and became punitive. The nights became hard, not because of sounds, but because of their absence. No murmur in the walls, no distant footsteps, only the sense of being too alone inside a space that had never been neutral. The solitude there wasn't the absence of people, it was the absence of validation. The house no longer responded because it was no longer being obeyed. It was in that state that the summons came, not a sound, not a voice, an inevitable pull, as if the house had decided it had tolerated enough resistance. She woke before dawn with absolute certainty that she needed to go downstairs, not out of fear, but out of closure. Her body knew the route. It always had. The main hall was lit only by the tall windows, where the gray morning light was beginning to seep in. In the center of the space, a table had been set, rare in a house where furniture almost never changed position. On the table, aligned with ritual precision, were the final elements: the dark dress, folded, a label with the new name, and beside it, a small blank card. He was there, standing with his hands braced on the table, like someone about to finish a long piece of work. His face didn't show triumph or threat. It showed fatigue, an old accumulated fatigue, not only from this attempt, but from all the previous ones. At last he spoke plainly. He talked about the first time, about the woman he loved before the house became a method. He spoke of her death, not as a tragic accident, but as an intolerable failure. He spoke of the absolute terror of letting love end in oblivion. The house had emerged as the answer, a place where nothing would have to end, where people could be kept intact, protected from the world and from themselves. The new name, he explained, wasn't cruelty. It was simplification, a name that removed edges, that made continuity possible. The women weren't replaced. They were refined, adjusted, preserved inside what had been love first. As he spoke, the house seemed to listen with reverence. Each word found an echo in the walls. It was a speech repeated many times, perfected, justified until it became internal truth. She listened without interrupting, and then she answered, not with accusation, not with rage, but with something he had never had to face, refusal without hatred. She said his love was real, but incomplete, that protecting someone from the world by erasing who they are is not love, it's fear, that the house didn't preserve lives, it preserved his inability to move through grief, that every erased name was one more death, not a salvation. Above all, she said she would not accept being a functional memory of someone she had never known. The final gesture was simple. She picked up the blank card, wrote her old name on it, firmly, without hurry, and set it beside the dress. Then she pushed the table gently, disrupting the perfect alignment. The dress slid. The label fell to the floor. The new name was left separate from everything else. The house reacted, not with violence but with exhaustion. A deep sound ran through the structure, like wood giving after bearing too much weight for too long. The walls seemed to lose their tension. The air changed. The silence stopped keeping watch. He didn't try to stop her. For the first time, there was no method left. Her refusal was total. There was no name to occupy, no assent. Without consent, the cycle couldn't close. She left at dawn. The road looked different, wider, more alive. The world outside the house wasn't kind or orderly, but it was real. Each step took her farther, not only from a place, but from a role that had never been hers. The house remained, but now it was only a house, without a name, without repetition, without anyone to continue. Years later, people passing through the town still speak of that place with unease. They say a love lived there that was too large to accept an ending. They say the house tried to preserve something that could not be kept. She, somewhere else, living another life, never again let anyone give her a name that wasn't her own. And that was the true rupture. Because sometimes survival isn't escaping, it's refusing to the very end what tries to love us by erasing us. It took her a while to realize that leaving the house didn't automatically mean leaving what the house had taught her body. In the first days away, there was a constant sense of improvisation, as if life were being lived without a script, without marks on the floor, without someone correcting the angle of things. The world felt excessive, loud, irregular, and yet strangely honest. Her old name began to return first in other people's mouths, people who said it without special care, without solemnity, without any intention of shaping her. At first, each time she heard her own name, there was a slight internal delay, as if the sound had to cross a larger space to reach her. Then, little by little, the name settled back into her body, recovering its weight, its texture, its memory. But the emptiness left by the new name wasn't a simple absence. It was a space that had been prepared to hold something, a functional identity, predictable, silent. And now that space had to be dismantled. Not destroyed, but emptied. That took time. She realized that for a long while she had mistaken calm for erasure. The house offered a peace that existed only because it eliminated friction, doubt, contradiction. Outside it, peace had to be built every day, through imperfect choices, small conflicts, fatigue that wasn't a sign of failure but of life in motion. Sometimes in places that were too quiet, old libraries, old hotels, empty houses, she felt a brief unease, as if the air were about to over-organize the space around her. In those moments, she remembered the sewing room, the labels, the lined-up dresses. And then she did something simple. She disrupted things on purpose, moved a chair, left an object out of place, said her own name under her breath just to hear the sound exist without an answer. The past didn't return as a concrete threat. There were no letters, no shifted objects, no attempts to rebuild the method. The cycle had been broken at the only point where it could be broken, a scent. Without someone willing to accept the name, the mold had nowhere to take hold. The house without continuity became only a slow ruin. Still, sometimes she thought of him, not with hatred, not with longing. She thought with the strangeness of someone who recognizes that love can rise from deep places and still choose devastating paths. He wasn't a simple villain. He was someone who had confused permanence with salvation, repetition with healing, control with care, and paid the price of never learning how to lose. She learned something else. She learned that identity isn't something handed to you ready-made, nor something someone else can keep for you. It's something you hold up every day, even when you're tired, even when it would be easier to fit into a mold that already exists, even when someone promises rest in exchange for silence. Years later, in a casual conversation, someone asked her if she believed in complete fresh starts. She thought for a moment before answering. She said no. She said nothing begins entirely from zero, but some choices change the direction of everything that comes after, and sometimes that is enough. If somewhere there was still a house breathing out of habit, she didn't need to know. Her name was no longer available for use. Her body was no longer trained to obey comfort that erases. The story didn't need to be forgotten. It only needed not to be repeated. And so, without rituals, without witnesses, without the need for perfect closure, the narrative dissolved into what it always should have been. The past, not as a permanent shadow, but as a learned boundary. The echo didn't disappear right away. It settled in. It became less a presence and more a backdrop, like the distant sound of a road you never see, but learn to ignore. Still, there were days when the past returned not as a clear memory, but as an inclination, a nearly imperceptible tendency to accept less than she deserved, to confuse silence with safety, to read care as surveillance. On those days, she had to stop, breathe, remember that discomfort is also a kind of information. Time did something curious to the story of the house. It didn't erase it, but it made it symbolic. It was no longer about a specific place, or a specific man, or a specific name. It became an inner language for recognizing certain patterns when they tried to return wearing new clothes, new voices, new promises. The method changed faces but kept its structure, and she had learned to recognize that structure too early to be fooled again. There were relationships afterward, some brief, others longer. In all of them, she carried a quiet attentiveness, not distrust of the other person, but watchfulness of herself. She noticed when she started lowering her voice to avoid conflict, when she felt guilty for wanting space, when someone spoke of protection the way one speaks of possession. In those moments, something in her stood up, not in aggressive defense, but in steady presence. She discovered that healthy love doesn't require new names. It doesn't ask for renaming or frames or labels. It accepts instability. It accepts that people change, that relationships transform, that nothing stays intact without losing its life. That kind of love doesn't promise preservation. It promises passage. On some nights, when exhaustion came heavy and the world felt too large, she remembered the house with a strange neutrality. There was no fascination left, no revulsion, only the awareness that an era had lived there, patiently engineered, the attempt to stop time. And nothing that tries to stop time remains without cost. The small town where everything began kept existing in its discreet way. People changed. Businesses closed. Other stories were born. The house, without maintenance, without function, began to blend into the landscape. It became a reference point only for those who needed to explain an old route. After that old house, they'd say. Not the house anymore, just an inert landmark. Some claimed that on days of thick fog you could still hear the sound of fabric being dragged. Others said it was only wind passing through hollow structures. She never investigated, not out of fear, but out of irrelevance. Whatever remained there no longer had access to what truly mattered, because true closure doesn't happen when something stops existing. It happens when it stops calling to you, and that story no longer called. She kept living with an awareness sharper than it was comfortable. She knew not every danger announces itself with violence, that some traps arrive as rest, that certain words repeated with too much tenderness have to be heard with doubled attention. But she also learned something gentler. Surviving an attempt at erasure doesn't turn someone into wreckage. It turns them into a witness, and witnesses carry something powerful, not the obligation to warn the entire world, but the ability to recognize when a story needs to end. Her name, spoken aloud now by people who knew her, came without expectation. It demanded no behavior. It carried no frame. It was just a name, and after everything, that was freedom enough. If someone asked what she had learned from all of it, she might not know how to answer right away, but if she had time, she would say something simple. That loving is not preserving, that protecting is not controlling, and that no house, no matter how quiet and beautiful, has the right to decide who someone should be. And so, with no doors slamming shut, no farewell music, no grand final scene, the story ends the way life usually ends the important things, not with a sudden period, but with the permanent absence of return. What remained afterward wasn't absolute silence, but a different kind of listening. She began to hear the world without the need to adjust herself to it. Before, every environment demanded reading, anticipation, adaptation. Now there was room for mistakes, for improvisation, for discomfort that didn't need to be immediately corrected. This freedom wasn't euphoric, it was sober, and for that very reason profound. Over time, she realized certain memories no longer returned as images but as inner structures. She couldn't clearly recall his face or the exact details of the house. What remained was the invisible architecture of the experience, the way control disguises itself as care, the way repetition presents itself as destiny, the way love can be used to soften symbolic violence. Those structures became an internal map, not to avoid the world, but to move through it with discernment. For a while, she felt strangely guilty for no longer feeling anything about the house, as if forgetting were a kind of betrayal of what had once been so intense. But then she understood. It wasn't forgetting, it was digestion. Some experiences have to be fully absorbed before they stop demanding an emotional return. Only then do they stop commanding. In certain moments, when she saw someone being reduced by a relationship that called itself love, she felt an almost physical urge to intervene. Not to warn, not to save, but to recognize. Recognition, she had learned, is the first step of any real rupture. Still, she knew everyone has their own timing. The house's mistake had been trying to force that timing. She began to write occasionally, not directly about the house, but about themes that orbited it: identity, name, permanence, loss. She wrote with no intention of publishing, more like someone arranging thoughts into lines so they don't spill out in confusion. In some pieces, images appeared, dresses without bodies, labels without objects, houses that breathe out of habit. In others, there were simply people walking out of places they no longer fit. These texts didn't ask for readers. They existed as quiet testimony that something had been crossed all the way through. Curiously, as the years passed, the story began to feel less exceptional. She started noticing diluted versions of the same logic in different contexts: workplaces that demanded self-erasure in the name of belonging, families that renamed individuals to keep them functional, relationships that promised stability in exchange for silence. The method wasn't rare. What had been rare was seeing it from the inside with such clarity and leaving. The house itself became almost an abstraction. In some old photographs of the town, it appeared in the background, partly covered by vegetation, as if it were slowly being returned to the ground. There were no more persistent reports, no organized rumors. The place had lost the ability to generate story. Without someone to occupy it symbolically, the house had become only matter, and that was right, because no structure built to deny an ending can survive once the ending is accepted. One ordinary afternoon, many years later, she walked past an antique shop and saw in the window a small wooden box with old labels. Her heart reacted for a second, not with fear, but with muscle memory. She stopped, looked, and realized those labels had different names. Every one of them. No repetition, no mold. Just records of things that belonged to someone and then went on their way. She smiled without quite noticing and kept walking. That simple gesture, keeping walking, became, over time, the most precise definition of freedom she knew. Not grand, proclaimed freedom, but the everyday kind, the freedom of not having to go back to confirm anything, of not having to prove something ended, of not having to carry a story as a constant warning. The story had done its work, and maybe that's what stories like this do when they finally end. They don't turn us into marked survivors, but into people capable of recognizing when something beautiful starts to demand too much, and of leaving before the name, the body, and the voice have to be negotiated. If someday someone offered her a new name with excessive tenderness, she would know how to hear not only the sound, but the intention, and she would know how to answer, not with confrontation, but with presence, because after everything, she had learned the hardest thing, that living fully isn't protecting yourself from the world. It's accepting the risk of being who you are, without guarantees, without frames, without repetition. And that lesson, quiet and irreversible, would keep echoing long after any house, any name, any story that tried to impose itself as destiny. When an echo stretches too long, it stops being noise and becomes landscape. That's what happened to the story inside her. Memories no longer startled her, they simply registered, the way you cross a familiar valley and no longer need to map every curve. The past wasn't a place to avoid anymore. It was ground she had already walked, marked in the spots where the earth gives way more easily. Over time, she realized the experience had changed her relationship with permanence. Before, there was an almost unconscious desire to last in places, to make sense inside offered structures, to fit. After the house, that desire shifted, not into cold detachment, but into discernment. Staying became a renewable choice, not a lifetime contract, and that changed everything. There was a period when she felt strangely invisible, not because no one saw her, but because she no longer presented herself as something finished. She didn't offer simplified versions of herself to make understanding easier. That pushed some people away. Others came closer carefully. And there were those who, once they realized they couldn't shape her, simply lost interest. She learned that kind of quiet filtering wasn't loss, it was saving her life. Sometimes, when she heard stories of love too intense, promises of absolute protection, homes that promised total shelter, she felt a small tug inside. Not envy, not fear, but clarity. She recognized the exact moment the language crossed the line between care and capture. That recognition didn't make her superior, it made her responsible. And responsibility, she knew, isn't a burden, it's a boundary. Her old name, now fully reintegrated, gained new layers. It was no longer only identity, it was a living reminder of resistance. Each time she wrote it, she felt the steadiness of the gesture, not as an aggressive claim, but as calm continuity. The name existed without needing to prove anything, and that, perhaps, was the greatest victory. On very quiet nights, when the city felt suspended and the wind carried distant sounds, she sometimes thought about the women in the photographs, not with abstract pity, but with a kind of shared mourning. She understood now none of them had been weak. They had been human, tired, needing rest. The house had offered rest in exchange for erasure, and some had accepted because, in that moment, it was all they could imagine as survival. That understanding brought something unexpected, compassion without romanticizing. There was no need to turn those lives into a warning or an absolute symbol. It was enough to recognize them as people who lived within the possibilities they had. And it was enough, too, to recognize she herself had almost become one more, not out of ignorance but out of exhaustion. As the years passed, the story stopped being something that needed to be told. It became something that quietly informed her choices. She no longer felt the urge to narrate it, to impress, warn, or explain. If someone asked, she would answer. If they didn't, she held it. Some experiences don't ask for an audience, they ask to be integrated. There was one specific day, too ordinary for anyone else to remember, when she realized the house had lost its last symbolic function. She was standing in some line, listening to disconnected chatter, when someone mentioned an old place that wasn't even worth visiting anymore. The description was vague, almost bored. She didn't recognize it immediately, no physical reaction, only the late realization that it could have been the house, and that it didn't matter. In that moment, she understood something final. The story no longer needed to be protected or feared. It was over not because it had been destroyed, but because it had lost emotional relevance. And relevance, she had learned, is what keeps cycles alive. The world still offered subtle temptations, ready-made structures, easy names, promises of instant belonging. But now a question rose automatically, almost without effort. What does this require me to stop being? If the answer was vague, she moved closer. If it was too clear, she stepped away. And so life went on, not in a straight line, not in constant safety, but in quiet loyalty to something that could no longer be negotiated. She didn't become immune to love. She became immune to erasure. And maybe that's the kind of ending stories like this deserve. Not spectacular redemption, not delayed justice, not perfect closure, just the calm continuation of someone who learned to recognize, in the middle of an imperfect world, the exact sound of their own name being spoken without any frame attached. Over time, she began to see that some experiences don't end because they're resolved, but because they dissolve. There wasn't a specific day she woke up free of every trace. Instead, there was a long sequence of ordinary mornings when the past no longer dictated the first thought, and for her, that became the most honest measure of change. The house had taught her, unwillingly, to pay attention to the invisible structures that organize life. Not only houses, but language, routines, affection. She started seeing the world as a set of symbolic spaces, some open, others carefully closed, and recognizing when she was being invited in not as a whole person, but as a function. That recognition didn't bring fear, but a calm, almost automatic step back. There were moments when she wondered who she would have been without that story, not as regret, but as late curiosity. Maybe she would have been lighter, maybe less vigilant, maybe more naive. But that line of thought always ended in the same place. There is no untouched version of anyone. Every identity is crossed through by encounters, losses, wrong choices, late exits. What matters isn't avoiding marks, but refusing to let them become shackles. She began to trust her own sense of discomfort more. Before, discomfort was something to fix quickly, to smother, explain away, resolve. Now it had become a quiet ally. When something felt too good, too organized, too safe, she paused, watched, asked herself what was being simplified in exchange for that stability. There wasn't always danger, but the question had to exist. In some seasons of her life, she missed the house's intensity, not the control, but the emotional concentration that place created. Everything there revolved around a defined center. Outside it, life was more scattered, less dramatic, less loaded with immediate meaning. It took her time to understand that this scatter was, in fact, freedom, that the absence of a fixed center allowed multiple focuses, multiple belongings, multiple versions to coexist without canceling each other out. Sometimes, watching someone who seemed too comfortable inside a narrow role, she felt a soft, almost sisterly sadness. She didn't know that person's story, and she didn't need to. It was enough to recognize the gesture, the body slightly folded to fit, the voice adjusted not to disturb, the name spoken in the expected tone. She didn't intervene. She had learned that no rupture can be outsourced. The world kept offering symbolic houses, relationships that promised absolute shelter, ideas that promised total belonging, places that offered silence in exchange for adaptation. She entered some, stayed a while, left when she felt the space starting to decide too much. There was no resentment in it, only the reading of signals. Once, years later, she visited an old house in another city, not out of attraction, but by chance. It was open to visitors, preserved, filled with stories of the families who had lived there. As she moved through the rooms, she felt a slight shiver, not fear, but bodily memory. She recognized the smell of old wood, the muffled sound of footsteps, the sensation of contained time. She stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, and kept going. Nothing pulled her back. Nothing called her. That was when she understood something with unexpected clarity. The old house's power wasn't in the architecture, or the man, or the name. It was in someone's willingness to be absorbed, so they wouldn't have to sustain their own instability, and that willingness no longer existed in her. She didn't become immune to the seduction of care. She still liked kind gestures, attention, closeness. But now she could tell the difference between care that supports and care that replaces. One cares so you can exist more fully, the other cares so you can exist less. That distinction didn't arrive as a fixed rule, but as an acquired sensitivity, an inner ear that recognizes when something starts to sound wrong, even if the melody is beautiful. Her name, spoken today, no longer carries extraordinary symbolic weight. It's just a name. And paradoxically, that makes it sacred, because nothing tries to use it as a tool, nothing tries to shape it. It exists in the world with no function beyond calling someone who answers whole. If at some point in life she had to sum up everything she'd learned, she might not talk about the house, or the man, or the stolen name. She would talk about something, simpler and harder at the same time: the right not to fit, the right to remain incomplete, unstable in transformation, the right to leave when a place starts to feel too comfortable. And maybe she would say, quietly, as if she didn't want to make it a lesson for anyone, that some stories don't teach us how to love better. They teach us when to go. So the story doesn't close like a circle. It doesn't return to the point of origin. It moves forward instead, uneven, open, alive. No promise of absolute protection. No final house, no imposed name. Just someone walking, alert, breathing, carrying not an active trauma, but a learned boundary. And that, quietly, is still enough. Enough, she realized, rarely feels grand when it happens. It settles in like a silent internal agreement, almost ordinary, that changes the way your feet meet the ground. Nothing spectacular, just a fine adjustment between what you accept and what you refuse. And once that adjustment is made, it doesn't need to be announced. There was a time, she believed, certain experiences left permanent marks, scars that defined the rest of the story. Now she understands some marks don't remain as open wounds, but as trained muscles. They don't hurt, they respond. They tighten when needed, relax when they can. They make the body more able to carry its own weight. The house now existed only as an abstract reference, almost conceptual, not as a place, but as a verb: to marry, to shelter, to protect. words she learned to hear with renewed attention. Inside each one, she looked for the question she'd learned to ask. Does this expand me or reduce me? Does this welcome me or replace me? Does this support me or decide for me? That question didn't make life simpler. It made it more honest. At times, she missed the house's illusory clarity. There, everything seemed to have a defined meaning, an exact place, a correct name. Outside it, things were ambiguous. Relationships required constant negotiation. Choices came without guarantees. But it was precisely in that ambiguity that she found room to exist without a frame. She started trusting closed narratives less and open processes more, promises less and observable behaviors more, names less and actions repeated over time more. The change didn't make her cynical, it made her attentive. And attentiveness, she learned, is a profound way of caring for yourself. There were days when the past felt too distant to matter, and others when it showed up like a faint shadow cast by something in the present. On those days, she didn't push it away. She simply acknowledged it, like nodding to someone you recognize on the street without needing to stop and talk. The acknowledgement was enough. She also understood that leaving the house didn't place her automatically in a permanent position of strength. There were moments of doubt, of almost slipping back into old patterns, of temptation toward comforting silences. But now there was something different, the awareness of choice. Even when she chose badly, she knew she was choosing. And that made all the difference. The new name, the one that had tried to impose itself, lost any residual power. It became only one possible sound among others, with no access to her body, no ability to summon her. Her old name, the true one, also stopped being a banner. It became ground, something that didn't need defending because it wasn't up for negotiation. She realized the deepest freedom isn't the kind that keeps you away from everything, but the kind that lets you enter without losing yourself. To enter relationships, places, stories, and to leave when the cost becomes too high, without excess guilt, without the need to justify your own integrity. If someone asked her today what the house truly represented, she might answer something unexpected, a mirror, not in the sense of instant revelation, but in the sense of amplification. The house amplified the exhaustion she already carried, the desire to rest from the effort of existing fully, and that amplification made the risk visible. Nothing there was entirely external. That's why the exit had to be internal before it could be physical. There were days when the past felt too distant to matter, and others when it showed up like a faint shadow cast by something in the present. On those days, she didn't push it away. She simply acknowledged it, like nodding to someone you recognize on the street without needing to stop and talk. The acknowledgement was enough. She also understood that leaving the house didn't place her automatically in a permanent position of strength. There were moments of doubt, of almost slipping back into old patterns, of temptation toward comforting silences. But now there was something different, the awareness of choice. Even when she chose badly, she knew she was choosing. And that made all the difference. The new name, the one that had tried to impose itself, lost any residual power. It became only one possible sound among others, with no access to her body, no ability to summon her. Her old name, the true one, also stopped being a banner. It became ground, something that didn't need defending because it wasn't up for negotiation. She realized the deepest freedom isn't the kind that keeps you away from everything, but the kind that lets you enter without losing yourself. To enter relationships, places, stories, and to leave when the cost becomes too high, without excess guilt, without the need to justify your own integrity. If someone asked her today what the house truly represented, she might answer something unexpected, a mirror, not in the sense of instant revelation, but in the sense of amplification. The house amplified the exhaustion she already carried, the desire to rest from the effort of existing fully, and that amplification made the risk visible. Nothing there was entirely external. That's why the exit had to be internal before it could be physical. She doesn't romanticize her choice. She knows many people can't leave when they need to. She knows sometimes survival requires adaptations that don't look ideal. What she carries isn't judgment, but a quiet commitment, not to collaborate with what erases, even when it arrives disguised as shelter. That commitment shows up in small things, saying no when yes would be easier, tolerating the tension of not fully belonging, accepting that some people will step away once they realize they won't get to define who she is. And still, life continues to offer real encounters, relationships where care doesn't come with a hidden manual, presences that don't demand renaming, people who aren't afraid of someone else's instability because they can live with their own. These encounters aren't perfect, they're alive. And that is enough. If the story feels too long to end, maybe it's because it doesn't really end, not as an event. It ends as an interrupted pattern, as repetition refused, As a silence that no longer calls, the house stayed behind, the name stayed, the body learned, and in the space between all of it, something simple and rare took root. The possibility of continuing without having to fit. There's no definitive epilogue for a story like this. Only conscious continuation, one step after another, no closed script, no promise of total protection, just someone living, and after everything that is enough. She began to notice that conscious continuation isn't a state you reach once and for all, but a quiet practice, renewed in the most ordinary details, how she chooses where to sit, how long she takes to answer a question, her right to change her mind without turning it into a moral failure. Small gestures that, added together, build a life that doesn't ask permission to exist. What's curious is that the more time passed, the less she needed to explicitly remember the house in order to recognize its effects. The experience had become a criterion. Not active trauma, but a filter. She didn't consciously compare new situations to the past. She simply felt when something started asking too much, when a relationship requested silence in exchange for comfort, when a space promised stability at the cost of her own voice. And in those moments, something inside her aligned with an almost physical clarity. No drama, just the certainty, this isn't it. There were times people read that posture as coldness, other times as excessive independence. Some mistook it for fear of commitment. She didn't rush to correct those interpretations. She'd learned that not every misunderstanding needs to be dismantled. Sometimes letting someone misread you is part of protecting something essential. She also learned to recognize when the desire to stay was coming from fear of leaving. That distinction was one of the hardest. For a long time she believed staying was proof of maturity and leaving was failure. The house had exploited that belief, turning endurance into virtue and adaptation into salvation. Outside it, she had to relearn that leaving can be an act of responsibility, not only to herself, but to the truth of the relationship. In certain stretches of life, she felt oddly without a fixed emotional address, not in the sense of total loneliness, but of not fully belonging, and it frightened her less than she'd expected. She discovered that not belonging completely to anything can be, paradoxically, a profound form of freedom, a state where you can move without dissolving. The memory of the women who came before her, those who accepted the name, the dress, the role, returned sometimes, but always differently, not as warning, not as mirror, but as recognized human presence. She thought of them as travelers who took possible roads under the conditions they had. There was no superiority in that, only the awareness that at that particular crossroads she had access to a crack others didn't have or couldn't use. That recognition brought humility, because leaving didn't make her better. It only kept her whole. One night, many years later, she dreamed of the house for the last time. Not as labyrinth, not as threat. In the dream, the house was empty, lit by an ordinary late afternoon light. No dress, no labels, no name echoing, just space. She walked through the rooms without hurry, watching dust in the air, wear on the furniture, time doing what it always does when it isn't, stopped. In the dream, she opened a window, and this time it opened all the way. Wind moved through the house without resistance, carrying the lavender scent until it dissolved. There was no formal goodbye. She simply left, knowing she didn't need to return, even in dreams. When she woke, she felt something close to gratitude, not for the house, or the man, or the story itself, but for the ability to pass through it without turning the experience into a total identity. She wasn't the one who escaped. She was simply someone who lived through something hard and continued. That difference was everything. Today, when she notices someone offering protection in exchange for reduction, she recognizes the gesture before the words can even organize themselves. And without anger, without speeches, without needing to convince, she simply doesn't enter. She doesn't argue with the invitation. She doesn't expose the intention. She just keeps living outside that gravitational field. Maybe that's what time does to certain stories. It doesn't erase them, it repositions them. They stop being center and become edge. And from the edge, you can see the whole world without being swallowed by it. Her story doesn't end because it doesn't need to. It continues in ordinary days, imperfect encounters, choices that don't look heroic but sustain something rare. The quiet integrity of someone who refuses to be named into fitting. And if someday someone tries to call her by a name that isn't hers, she'll recognize the sound, not as a threat, but as a signal. And if she answers, she'll answer only with what she learned to protect above all: presence without concession, movement without fleeing, life without a frame, and that, even without applause, even without solemn closure, will keep being the most radical gesture of all. She realized then that the hardest kind of radical act isn't breaking, it's sustaining. Sustaining a life that offers no absolute guarantees, no total shelter, no organizing center. Sustaining her own presence day after day, without hiding behind names, functions, or ready-made narratives. That demanded a kind of courage less visible but more constant. There were stretches when that sustaining was tiring, not dramatic, not tragic, just tiring. Moments when it would have been simpler to accept a label, a clear role, a defined expectation. When it would have felt comfortable to let someone else decide the rhythm, the limits, the acceptable version of who she was. In those moments, the memory of the house didn't appear as an image, but as a bodily sensation, a soft tightening, a discreet alarm, a no that didn't need words. She learned to trust that no. She also learned that not every refusal needs an explanation, that over-justifying a choice is often a way of asking permission to exist, and she no longer asked, not out of arrogance, but out of vital economy. She had learned, in the deepest way possible, that life is exhausted when it is constantly negotiated. Over time, something curious happened. The people who stayed close to her were the ones who didn't try to overname her. They didn't ask, "Who are you?" expecting a fixed answer. They accepted movement. They accepted contradictions. They accepted days when she was closer and days when she needed space. These people didn't offer absolute protection. They offered companionship, and she discovered that was infinitely rarer. She started noticing how many stories of love, of work, of social belonging are organized around an implicit promise. If you adjust, you'll be kept. If you fit, you won't be abandoned. The house had taken that promise to an extreme, turning it into architecture, method, ritual. Outside it, the promise still existed, more diluted, more acceptable, harder to see, but she could recognize it, and by recognizing it, she could choose. One day someone said, almost as a compliment, that she seemed hard to define. Once that would have sounded like a disguised criticism. In that moment, it sounded neutral. She smiled, thanked them, and moved on. There was nothing to correct. Being hard to define meant she wasn't available for simplifications that cost too much. She began to think about names, not only her own, but names in general, as symbolic contracts. Some names call, others fence in, others imprison. The name they tried to give her didn't just want to identify her, it wanted to lock her into a specific emotional function. Now she could hear the difference. She knew when a name arrived as an invitation, and when it arrived as a frame, and whenever possible, she chose the invitation. Time kept doing its quiet work. The memory of the house lost detail, but it didn't lose meaning. That mattered, because forgetting details doesn't erase learning. If anything, the deepest learning is the kind that no longer needs images to exist. She became someone who moves through places with calm attention. She doesn't look for perfect houses, sealed relationships, complete systems. She looks for signs of circulation, windows that open, doors that don't require an emotional password, spaces you can enter without leaving something essential on the other side. Sometimes someone would ask if she didn't miss truly belonging. The question almost always carried a specific idea of belonging, fusion, total surrender, the dissolving of individual boundaries. She would think for a few seconds before answering, not because she didn't know, but because the answer had to be precise. Belonging for her had become something else. It wasn't being absorbed, but being recognized. It wasn't staying at any cost, but being welcome as long as she was whole. It wasn't having a fixed place, but having the freedom to move without punishment, and that changed everything. There was a moment, simple, ordinary, when she realized she no longer had to prove anything to herself. She was in an everyday room, talking about irrelevant things, when she laughed at something trivial and felt her body relax in an old, forgotten way. There was no internal vigilance, no self-adjustment, just presence. That tiny instant was more revealing than any past confrontation, because it showed her the house no longer lived in her. The cycle hadn't only been interrupted, it had lost the space where it could reinstall itself. And maybe that's how truly long stories end, not with grand final revelations, but with the quiet realization that something is no longer necessary, that a pattern has lost its grip, that a structure collapses without sound because it no longer has anything to lean on. She kept living without expecting perfect closure. Some questions remained unanswered, some images never fully clarified, and that stopped bothering her. Not everything has to be solved to stop commanding you. What matters is this: she wasn't renamed, wasn't folded, wasn't stored for future use. She went on, and going on after everything wasn't an absence of story. It was the definitive proof the story no longer decided for her. she began to notice that what we call identity is rarely something solid from the start. It's closer to a moving field, a set of forces that balance and rebalance as the body passes through time. The house had tried to fix that field, to turn it into something preservable, as if the flow could be stopped without losing something essential. Outside it, she learned to accept the opposite, that living inevitably means losing versions of yourself. That acceptance didn't arrive as easy comfort. There were moments of quiet grief for the people she had been and would never be again. The young woman who believed love was unconditional shelter. The woman who mistook constant attention for care. The version of herself who let herself be named so she wouldn't have to explain too much. Those versions had to die, in some way, for her to keep going. And no symbolic death happens without resistance. Over time, she stopped asking, "Who am I?" like someone hunting for a definition, and started asking, "What in me is still alive?" The shift sounded subtle, but it changed everything about how she moved through the world. She no longer chased absolute coherence between past, present, and future. She allowed herself contradictions. She allowed herself to change without turning it into guilt. She allowed herself to stay without promising forever. The house had been built on the refusal of that permission. There, everything had to repeat in order to make sense. The name had to be the same. The dress had to fit. The woman had to fit. Outside it, she discovered meaning doesn't come from repetition, but from imperfect continuation, from what keeps moving even when it doesn't fully recognize itself. At times, she felt a strange kind of gratitude for the experience, not for the attempted erasure, not for the symbolic violence, but for the raw learning no book could have given her. The house was an extreme, and extremes, when crossed with clarity, reveal with sharp precision what cannot be negotiated. She now knew, with rare accuracy, where her line was. That line wasn't rigid. It wasn't a wall. It was more like a sensitive threshold. When someone approached with real interest, there was space. When they approached with the intent to shape her, her body stepped back before her mind had to decide. An intelligence built not from thought, but from embodied experience. She also realized the desire to be protected never disappeared entirely. It simply moved. Instead of seeking protection in people or closed structures, she began building it internally, through simple things: financial autonomy, diverse friendships, moments of voluntary solitude. That protection wasn't absolute, but it was honest. It didn't promise invulnerability. It promised enough support to make it through falls. There were phases when she felt too out of place for certain environments, too independent for some relationships, too quiet for other people's expectations. Once that would have triggered anxiety. Now it stirred curiosity. "I don't fit here," she would think without drama, and moving on became as natural as breathing. The world, of course, didn't reorganize itself around her choice. It kept offering ready-made narratives, comfortable molds, promises of total belonging. But something had shifted in how she listened. Certain speeches no longer got through. Certain words lost their force in the air before they reached her. It was as if the vocabulary of control had become too recognizable to work. Sometimes, looking at old houses, not that one but others scattered through cities in memory, she would think about how places absorb human intention. A house built to welcome ages one way. A house built to contain decays another. The first grows old softly. The second rots in silence. Maybe the same was true for relationships, for names, for stories. She didn't need to visit ruins to learn that anymore. Time moved on without asking permission, as it always does. New losses came. New joys, too. Life didn't become simpler, only more livable. And she learned that livable is a better measure than constant happiness. Livable means possible, breathable. It means that even on hard days, something in you remains recognizable. On one ordinary late afternoon, watching people hurry past on some street, she had a thought that didn't feel like a conclusion, but like a calm observation. The house had tried to turn her into a living souvenir of a love that couldn't tolerate endings. By refusing that, she chose something riskier, being a conscious passenger in her own story. Nothing guarantees that choice will always be comfortable, but it guarantees something rarer, movement without erasure. And so, without needing one last symbol, without returning to the origin, without an aesthetically neat reconciliation with the past, the narrative kept stretching forward, not as a long shadow, but as an open road that required no new name to be walked. She walked, and each step, however small, reaffirmed what no house, no distorted love, no method of preservation had managed to destroy: the ongoing possibility of being, changing, and going on without asking permission to exist. She began to notice that walking, in the most literal sense, had become an intimate metaphor. walking without a rigid destination, without a promised arrival, walking to feel the weight of her own body in space, to confirm she still occupied a place in the world without having to justify it. There was something deeply restorative in that simple act, as if each step reaffirmed an autonomy that had once demanded so much energy to defend. On some of those walks, she watched houses, not as threats, but as quiet narratives. Some looked open, with careless windows and plants growing without strict order. Others displayed too much symmetry, hedges trimmed too sharply, doors always closed. She didn't judge, she simply noticed. She knew now that every structure reveals something about the kind of permanence it expects. That awareness extended to people as well, not as diagnosis, but as a sensitive reading. Some approached offering immediate shelter, ready-made solutions, easy names for complex feelings. Others approached offering nothing but uncertain presence. With the latter, she felt less immediate security and more truth. She came to value relationships where silence didn't need to be filled, where temporary distance wasn't treated as a threat, where coming back didn't require dramatic explanations. These relationships didn't promise eternal continuity, but they offered something rarer, elasticity. And elasticity, she learned, is what prevents total breakage when the weight increases. There was a time she believed she had to understand everything that happened in the house in order to move on, every detail, every motive, every flaw in the other. Now she sees that need for total understanding was part of the same impulse that fed the cycle, the belief that if everything makes sense, nothing will be lost. But life doesn't work that way. Some things are lost even when understood, and accepting that isn't giving up, it's maturity. She stopped seeking perfect coherence between who she was and who she is. She allowed herself to be made of layers that don't fit perfectly together. The house didn't need to speak to every part of her life. It could exist as a separate chapter with real consequences, but without total control over the story. That conscious fragmentation brought lightness, not naive lightness, but the kind that comes when you no longer demand total unity. She could be multiple without feeling fake. She could change without feeling like she was betraying an earlier version of herself. Sometimes, when someone spoke nostalgically about a place where everything made sense, she felt a gentle discomfort. Not because she disagreed, but because she knew the hidden price of that promise. Places where everything makes sense usually require someone to give up whatever doesn't fit, and she already knew the cost of that surrender. The house now appeared in her memory as an allegory too clear to be frightening. It represented the human desire to freeze what we love, to preserve without accepting inevitable wear, a desire that's understandable, almost tender at its origin, and devastating in its execution. She didn't have to hate it to reject it. As the years passed, the story became less about what was done to her, and more about what she chose not to allow. That inversion mattered, not so she could feel strong, but so she could feel responsible for herself in a way that didn't crush her, responsibility without guilt, autonomy without isolation. There was a day, ordinary and unannounced, when she realized she no longer asked, "What if I had stayed?" The question simply didn't appear anymore, not because the answer was obvious, but because the question had lost emotional relevance. The life unfolding now didn't compete with that possibility. It was something else, and that was enough. She came to recognize the value of imperfect endings, endings that don't close every door, that leave loose threads, that offer no clear lesson. The house didn't have a theatrical finale. There was no exemplary punishment, no full redemption. There was wear, abandonment, silence, and she realized that is the fate of most structures that try to last beyond what life allows. Maybe that's why she stopped seeking stories that promise absolute closure. She preferred narratives that keep breathing after the last page, stories that don't say it's over, but it continues differently. And hers continued, not as a warning, not as trauma, not as a central identity, but as an integrated memory, an embodied boundary, a lesson that no longer needed to be actively recalled in order to work. She kept living with calm attention, knowing the world would always offer new houses, new names, new promises of protection, and knowing with the same calm that she could enter, leave, stay or go without having to erase herself to do it. That was the true inheritance of what she had lived. Not constant vigilance, but the ability to choose without betraying herself. And as she walked, breathed, made mistakes, and began again, like any living person, the story stretched on, not as a shadow pulling her backward, but as ground firm enough to allow the next step, without a frame, without substitution, without any need to be preserved, just alive. With nearly serene clarity, she realized that being alive isn't a permanent state of lucidity, but a continual alternation between presence and distraction. There were days she moved through the world with full attention, recognizing limits, choosing carefully. On others, she let herself be carried by the usual flow, forgetting to watch for signs, relaxing her inner guard. And it didn't put her at risk the way it once had, because now, even when she got distracted, something deep remained awake. The house had tried to teach her to exist as a preserved object. Life outside taught the opposite, that existing means accepting wear, noise, impermanence, that everything living changes, dulls, transforms, and that this isn't failure, it's condition. She began to notice how fear of loss shaped so many human choices, people clinging to rigid routines, to relationships that no longer breathe, to old versions of themselves. Not out of cruelty, but out of terror of the emptiness that seems to appear when something ends. The house had been the extreme materialization of that fear, a place built to avoid endings at any cost, a cost that in the end demanded everything. That understanding didn't make her immune to the pain of loss. She still felt it when something ended, when someone left, when a phase dissolved. The difference was that now she let the pain exist without immediately trying to turn it into structure. She didn't need to build a house around grief. She could move through it. On some nights when the world felt too large and the future too open, she felt the pull of something like total shelter, a place where everything was predictable, organized, quiet. In those moments, she recognized the desire without following it. She knew she didn't want the shelter, she wanted rest. And rest could be found without renaming, without confinement, without a frame. She learned to rest without disappearing. She also learned that control rarely shows up as an explicit threat. It arrives as excessive care, ready-made solutions, easy names for complex emotions. It arrives offering immediate relief. And that's why so many people enter, not out of naivete, but out of fatigue. That insight made her less judgmental and more attentive. When someone talked about making everything work, she listened for the intention beneath the phrase. Sometimes it was just hope. Other times it was refusal to accept limits. She didn't need to confront it. She just didn't commit beyond what she could actually hold. She kept her right to leave when the cost grew too high. Her name, now fully integrated into everyday life, no longer needed to be reaffirmed. It showed up in documents, quick messages, trivial conversations. Each time it was spoken, it triggered neither defense nor pride. It was simply reference. And that was the sign her identity was no longer in dispute. She began to understand that some stories don't make us stronger in a heroic sense. They don't produce exuberant courage or inspiring speeches. They produce something more discreet, precision, the ability to sense early when something begins asking too much. And that precision, quiet and uncelebrated, is what lets life continue without future catastrophes. The house no longer needed to be mentioned or symbolized. It existed only as the origin point of a lesson that had spread into every corner of her life. There was no need to revisit it, physically or mentally. The past had done its work by no longer demanding attention. And so, without a closing ritual, without one last striking image, without a definitive line, the narrative kept extending through ordinary time, through days not worth remembering, through small choices, through almost imperceptible detours that accumulated, build an entire life. She went on with a quiet trust in her discomfort when it surfaced, and an equally quiet acceptance of moments of real rest. She no longer searched for perfect houses. She searched for circulation. She no longer searched for new names. She searched for listening. And maybe that's what remains when everything that tried to contain us loses its strength. The ability to move forward without hurry, without promises, without fear of not fitting. The story didn't need more words to keep going. It continued in a moving body, in a step that doesn't rush to arrive, in an eye that recognizes when something starts to close in too tightly. And as long as there is a world, there will be choices. As long as there are choices, there will be risk. And as long as there is risk, there will be life. She accepted that, and she continued. She began to understand that accepting risk wasn't the same as living in a constant state of alert. There was a subtle but decisive difference between attention and vigilance. Vigilance consumes you, tightens you, narrows your field of vision. Attention, by contrast, widens it. It lets you notice without reacting immediately. It lets you feel without getting lost. That transition marked the quietest and at the same time the most transformative period of her life. For a long time, she believed surviving the house would require always being ready to spot danger. But as the years passed, she realized the deepest lesson had been something else, trusting her ability to leave when necessary. That trust wasn't arrogance or naive optimism. It was embodied experience. She already knew, in her body, that she could go, and that made staying a real choice, not a trap. At times, she caught herself staying in places she once would have avoided. not because they were safe in any absolute sense, but because now she could hold ambiguity without dissolving. She could negotiate boundaries without over-explaining. She could remain without confusing closeness with fusion. That ability didn't arrive fully formed. It was built through small decisions repeated over time, nearly invisible to anyone watching from the outside. She learned to recognize a specific kind of exhaustion, different from the exhaustion that had led her to the house. It wasn't the fatigue of fully existing, but the fatigue of explaining who you are, what you want, why something no longer works. When that fatigue appeared, she knew she needed silence, not shelter, space, not containment. That distinction saved her more than once. There were stretches when life felt too disorganized, without a clear axis, without a coherent narrative. Once that would have brought anguish. Now it brought curiosity. She began to see the absence of a fixed axis as a sign of motion, not loss. Not every life needs to orbit a single center. Some expand better as a constellation. That shift also changed her relationship with the future. She stopped imagining it as a stable place to reach and started seeing it as an open field of imperfect possibilities. There was no promise of absolute safety, and that stopped being a problem. The future didn't have to protect her. It only had to exist. In casual conversations, when someone talked about building something forever, she felt a slight tightening inside. Not automatic rejection, but questioning. Building can be beautiful, but forever almost always carries a silent demand for immobility, and she had learned the cost of that. She preferred to build something that could change shape, shrink, expand, even end, without turning into emotional ruins. She also noticed how many people confuse steadiness with control. They think loving means keeping everything in the same place, repeating gestures, preserving dynamics. But true steadiness, she discovered, lives in the willingness to recalibrate, to hear when something no longer works, to let the other person transform without treating that as a threat. The house had never understood that. It had been built to prevent transformation, to keep intact what had already changed, and because of that, it was doomed to fail. No structure built against time can survive without becoming violent. She, by contrast, was aging differently, not hardening but refining, becoming more sensitive to her own needs, clearer about her limits, more tolerant of uncertainty. Aging stopped being something to fear and became something to accompany. Each phase brought real losses and also unexpected reliefs. There was a day she realized she no longer needed to explain to herself what she'd lived. The story was integrated enough that it no longer demanded a running narration. It didn't need to be retold or revisited. It existed as a silent foundation, something that holds you up without showing, and that was liberating. Because from there, she could allow herself not to know. Not know what was coming. Not know whether certain choices would work out. Not know whether she'd stay in the same places or change everything again. The house had promised knowing who she was, knowing what was best, knowing how everything should be. Outside it, she discovered that not knowing isn't failure. It's space. Space for listening, space for mistakes, space for change. She learned to inhabit that space without excessive anxiety, not as someone who masters it, but as someone who trusts. Trusts not the world or other people, but her own ability to respond when something starts to tighten too much. And so the story stretched on not as a stubborn echo, but as an open horizon. There was no house waiting, no alternate name being prepared, no silent mold closing in. There was only a person walking, attentive, imperfect, whole enough to keep going without needing to be preserved. And in the end, that was the most honest kind of continuity she could have chosen. As the years went by, she began to notice something she once would have missed. The way the body learns before language does. There were situations where nothing seemed objectively wrong. Pleasant conversations, comfortable spaces, reasonable promises, and still her body signaled a small step back, a minimal resistance, almost polite. Before, she would have ignored that signal in the name of adapting. Now she paused, listened. Not to run immediately, but to understand what was being asked in exchange for staying. That learning didn't make her inflexible. It made her selective. And there was a deep difference between the two. Inflexibility shuts paths out of fear. Selectivity chooses them out of clarity. She still let herself try, fail, sometimes insist longer than she should, but she no longer mistook insisting for virtue. She began to see that many systems, emotional, professional, social, work better when someone agrees to carry the invisible weight of maintenance. The house had been sustained by that kind of weight. The quiet labor of adjusting, not disturbing, fitting. Outside it, she learned to notice when people asked her for that same labor, disguised as loyalty or maturity. She didn't always refuse, but now she knew the cost, and choosing while knowing changes everything. At times she felt strangely lonely, Not because she lacked people, but because she didn't fit easily into ready-made narratives. There were fewer places where she could simply abandon herself to the collective flow. But that loneliness had a different texture from the one she'd felt before. It wasn't emptiness, it was unoccupied space. And space, she learned, can be fertile. She started valuing brief encounters that promised nothing beyond themselves, conversations that existed only in that moment, connections that didn't demand definition. They didn't build symbolic houses, they opened windows, and sometimes a window was all someone needed. There were new losses too, unrelated to the house, simply inevitable, people drifting away, cycles ending, expectations not being met. The difference now was that she didn't try to turn each loss into structure. She didn't need to give every ending a meaning bigger than it had. Some things end because they end, and that didn't require further explanation. She realized the impulse to preserve, so strong in the house, often comes from refusing to trust life's own motion. To preserve is to try to freeze what should circulate, and circulation implies risk, wear, change. Outside it, she learned to trust that motion more, even when it hurt, even when there was no guarantee of replacement. Sometimes she thought of the woman in the first photograph, holding the label with the imposed name. She didn't think of her as a passive victim, but as someone who may have arrived at the house when her exhaustion was simply too great. That empathy didn't lessen the gravity of what had happened, but it removed simplistic judgment. The house didn't feed on weakness, it fed on a legitimate human need that had been met in the wrong way. That understanding made her more careful when offering help. She didn't promise total shelter, she didn't offer complete solutions. When she cared for someone, she made a point of not becoming the center of that person's life. She knew now that the most ethical care is care that doesn't create silent dependence. She began trusting grand gestures less and small consistencies more. People who said little and did what they said. Environments that weren't organized around invisible control. Relationships that allowed pauses without punishment. Those signs, once too subtle to compete with big promises, became her main criteria. If the house still existed physically somewhere, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that it no longer existed as an internal possibility. There was no psychic room left for a place that demanded renaming, total containment, progressive erasure. The structure had been dismantled from the inside, piece by piece, unhurried, without spectacle, and it took time. Time to make mistakes again. Time to almost repeat patterns. Time to learn that awareness doesn't prevent relapses, but it does allow quicker exits. She no longer saw herself as cured of anything. Being cured would imply a final, stable state free of risk. She saw herself as in an ongoing relationship with her own freedom, one that required care, updating, steady listening, and maybe that was the biggest contrast with the house. There, everything had to be definitive. Outside it, everything could be revised. Her story no longer moved in a straight line or a closed circle. It moved in an open spiral, touching old themes from new angles without ever returning to the same point. Each turn brought less weight, less urgency, less need to prove. She kept going, not away from something, but toward a way of existing that didn't require artificial preservation. And as she went, the narrative stopped being something that had to be told in order to justify itself. It became simply life in motion. Days clear, days confused, choices good, choices questionable, all of it fit. No imposed name, no house waiting, no fear of not lasting, just possible continuity. And that finally was peace enough. She discovered that peace enough doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a logical conclusion or a complete feeling. It seeps in slowly, almost without ceremony, until one day you realize certain urgencies are gone. There was no warning that her body was no longer on high alert, only the simple fact that it rested when it could and reacted when it had to, without confusing one for the other. Time began to be lived with less drama. Before, every choice felt too final, as if any decision might send her back to a place she might not be able to leave again. Now, decisions carried weight but didn't paralyze. They were made with an awareness of risk, not terror of it. That difference changed everything. She began to notice she'd developed a more honest relationship with error. Making mistakes stopped being proof of weakness or a return to old patterns. It became part of motion. When she messed up, she didn't immediately try to justify, correct, or turn the mistake into symbolic learning. Sometimes she simply accepted it. There are mistakes that teach nothing beyond human limits, and that is enough. At times she felt a new kind of tiredness, not the tiredness that asks for shelter, but the tiredness that asks for a pause not as escape, but as a temporary suspension of the need to make meaning. In those pauses, she didn't hunt for answers or narratives. She let time pass without demanding immediate significance. And that simple, radical gesture was something the house never would have allowed. She realized one of the house's subtlest violences had been its refusal of the interval. Everything there had to serve a purpose, preserve, repeat, fit. Outside it, she learned the value of the unproductive interval, the day that goes nowhere, the conversation that builds nothing, the silence that isn't preparing a response. Those intervals didn't erase life. They made it breathable. Sometimes when she thought of the man who had called her by another name, she no longer felt anger or active compassion. She felt something harder to name, an ethical distance, as if she recognized in him a boundary that didn't need crossing or fighting. He had existed as part of a story that no longer needed continuation. Thinking of him didn't pull her back. It was simply a fact. She also stopped looking for signs that she had won that story. She didn't need to prove she was better, stronger, freer. Those comparisons, she realized, were another form of captivity, a way of keeping the past as the main reference point. True distance came when the past stopped being the measure. The world was still full of closed places disguised as shelter, still offering easy names, ready roles, compact identities. She wasn't immune to those invitations. Sometimes she still felt the pull. The difference was that now she could recognize the cost before stepping in, and recognizing the cost meant she could choose differently. She began trusting relationships that didn't present themselves as solutions, people who didn't promise to complete her, protect her from the world, or offer a final place. People who were there, available, but not invasive. Those relationships didn't have the house's seductive intensity. They had something less shiny and more durable, imperfect reciprocity. There were days she wondered if this way of living was too lonely, but the question came with less fear each time. It was genuine curiosity, not an internal accusation. And most of the time, the answer arrived not as an argument, but as a feeling. She was alone only when she needed to be, and accompanied when she chose. The memory of the house no longer appeared as image or sensation. It appeared as a quiet criterion, an inner line that said without drama, yes here, no here. That line wasn't rigid. It could be revised, but it existed, and that was enough. Over time, she understood the house had failed because it tried to make love static. Outside it, she learned that loving is accompanying change, not preventing it. That bonds don't strengthen by eliminating risk, but by moving through it with mutual consent. None of this made her wise in an idealized way. It made her simply more responsible for her own place in the world. Responsible without excessive weight, responsible without heroism, just conscious. And so, without needing formal closure, without requiring one last symbolic act, the story kept expanding inside ordinary life. Not as active trauma, not as a repeated lesson, but as a quiet background that supports choices. She wasn't preserved, wasn't renamed, wasn't stored. She lived, with flaws, pauses, detours, returns, without letting anyone decide for her the final shape of her existence. And maybe that's what remains when a long, dense, quiet story dissolves into time. Not a conclusion, but a capacity. The capacity to recognize when something starts to close in too much. The capacity to leave without turning the leaving into spectacle. The capacity to continue without needing to remain intact. And as long as that capacity exists, the story doesn't have to end. It simply goes on. She began to realize that going on didn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes going on meant staying where she was longer than expected without turning that staying into stagnation. There was a fine-grained lesson in that, distinguishing when staying was choice and when it was fear in disguise. The distinction didn't arrive instantly. It came as a delayed sensation, an inner adjustment that only became obvious after a stretch of silence. From the outside, the world looked the same. People still talked about stability, safety, finding a definitive place. She listened to those conversations with an attention that wasn't critical, but historical. She knew where that desire came from. She knew how it could turn into prison when it went unexamined. Still, she didn't feel the need to warn anyone. Each person has to discover, in their own time, what they're willing to pay in order not to lose. She learned that losing is part of living with integrity. Losing versions of yourself. Losing relationships that no longer hold. Losing idealized images of the future. The house had been a radical attempt to eliminate loss, and it had failed for that very reason. Outside it, she began to accept loss as inevitable motion, not an enemy. That didn't make her indifferent. It made her less violent toward herself when something slipped away. On some days she felt a strange kind of nostalgia, not for the house itself, but for the concentrated intensity it produced. Everything there seemed loaded with meaning. Outside it, life was more scattered, less theatrical. It took her time to understand that scatter was a sign of health. Constant intensity has a high cost. Ordinary daily life, by contrast, lets you breathe. She began finding beauty in things that once would have seemed too small to deserve attention. The way light shifted tone across an afternoon, the irregular sound of footsteps on the street, conversations that led nowhere. Those details didn't build a narrative, and that was freeing. Not everything had to serve a larger story. Over time, she realized the house hadn't only been an external place but an internal proposal, the promise that someone else could take on the labor of existing for her, tell her who she was, where she belonged, how she should move. By refusing that proposal, she took on something heavier and simpler at the same time, the ongoing responsibility of listening to herself. That listening wasn't perfect. There were days she missed the tone, ignored signals, stayed where she should have left. But now when that happened, returning to herself was faster. There was no inner punishment, only a gentle correction, like adjusting your route after realizing you've drifted a little too far. She also began to see that freedom isn't cumulative. You don't win it once and store it away. It has to be exercised, small daily acts of fidelity to your own limits, small no's said in time, small yeses said with real presence. They didn't look grand, but they were decisive. Years later, there came a moment when someone tried again to offer her a kind of total shelter, not a physical house, but a relationship structured around promises of absolute care, emotional fusion, silent exclusivity. For an instant, the invitation sounded tempting. Her body recognized the pattern before her mind formed words. She felt that slight tightening, that old signal, and this time there was no internal drama, only clarity. She thanked them and didn't step inside. That simple gesture confirmed something important. The story hadn't only been overcome, it had been integrated in a functional way, not as fear that paralyzes, but as memory that orients. The house was no longer a shadow. It was a distant reference point, useful only for marking where not to return. She kept living with the awareness that no place, no person, no narrative should demand the surrender of her own voice, and that when something starts asking for too much silence, the problem isn't the world, it's the unspoken agreement she's about to accept. So life kept unfolding without the need for a fixed center. She formed bonds, loosened others, changed direction when she needed to. She no longer searched for perfect houses. She looked for paths that allowed coming and going, relationships that didn't lock doors, places that didn't require excessive adaptation in order to be lived in. The story now showed up less as a closed narrative and more as an open field of possible choices. And within that field she walked without hurry, without promises, without the fear of not lasting. Because she had finally learned that staying intact was never the goal, living whole was. And as long as there was room for that, for mistakes, change, leaving, staying, the story would continue, not as the echo of an old house, but as a living presence in ordinary time. No frame, no imposed name, no need to be preserved, just going on. She came to understand that going on, in the deepest sense, wasn't moving towards something defined, but sustaining enough openness for the next step to exist without coercion. That openness wasn't constant enthusiasm or blind faith. It was availability. Availability built on clear limits, on attention to her own reactions, on the willingness to stop moving when something began to demand too much. There were periods when other people mistook that openness for indecision. Some said she always seemed between things, never fully settled. She heard those comments without urgency to explain herself. She knew that for people who measure life by fixed milestones, continuous movement looks like failure. For her, it had become a form of honesty. By contrast, the house had taught her that rigid structures offer immediate relief but charge silent loyalty. Outside it, she came to prefer porous structures, places that allowed change, relationships that didn't require total alignment, work that didn't confuse dedication with submission. None of it was perfect, but all of it was breathable. Over time, she stopped looking for belonging as external confirmation. She didn't need to be recognized in order to feel real. Belonging became internal, the feeling that she wasn't betraying herself in order to stay. When that feeling existed, a place worked. When it didn't matter how beautiful or safe the place seemed. In moments of deep exhaustion, she still felt the impulse to disappear for a while. But now she could tell the difference between disappearing and resting. Disappearing meant erasing traces, shrinking her presence, becoming less. Resting meant pausing demands without giving up herself. That difference, once almost invisible, became essential. She began noticing how many people live exhausted not because they do too much, but because they do it against themselves. They keep agreements they never revisit, names they never chose, places that no longer fit who they've become. The house had been an extreme example of that. Outside it, she started revising agreements more often, even when it was uncomfortable. There was no heroism in that revision. Only humility, admitting something that once worked doesn't work anymore, admitting changing your mind doesn't invalidate what you chose before, admitting life isn't a sealed architectural project, but ground that shifts over time. She felt less responsible for maintaining perfect coherence. Coherence, she learned, isn't repetition. It's fidelity to what is alive now. That fidelity requires ongoing listening, not rigidity. And listening is tiring, but it frees. At some point she realized she no longer needed to say the word freedom very often, not because it mattered less, but because it stopped being a distant ideal. It became daily practice, a set of almost invisible micro-choices that together held something essential. She also saw that the house hadn't only taught her about control. It had taught her, unintentionally, about the danger of confusing love with permanence. Outside it, she began valuing loves that didn't promise to last, but were whole while they existed. Loves that didn't demand guarantees, only real presence. Those loves weren't less intense, they were less possessive. And that made all the difference. Sometimes, thinking about the story as a whole, she felt a small kind of awe at the fact that she was still there, living, choosing, failing. Not heroic survival, but simple continuation. The house had tried to turn life into a monument. Outside it, she discovered the value of what becomes no one's monument, what changes, wears down, gets rebuilt. She no longer needed to prove she'd left. Didn't need to display independence. Didn't need to turn the experience into a public identity. The story had done its work by becoming quiet. When something no longer needs to be told, it's a sign it no longer commands. And so the narrative kept, expanding not through words, but through ordinary choices. Discreet refusals, conscious stays, departures without guilt. She walked without expecting to arrive at any definitive place. She knew now that the desire for absolute arrival often hides a fear of continuing in motion, and she no longer had enough fear to want to stop. As long as there was room to adjust, revise, leave, and enter without erasing herself, life would be livable. Imperfect, uncertain, sometimes tiring, but livable. And after everything, that was more than she had ever asked for. The story didn't need to end because there was nothing left to solve. There was only what to live. And living for her meant this: to keep going attentively, to keep going possible, to keep going without handing her voice over to any house, to any name, to any promise that demanded silence in exchange for rest. She kept going. And the world, imperfect as always, kept offering paths, some too narrow, others open enough. She chose. She chose, and over time realized that choosing wasn't a single act, but a continuous state of adjustment. There was no final choice that guaranteed eternal peace. There were only renewed choices, made from what was alive in that moment, that required presence, and presence required accepting that not everything can be decided in advance. There were days when that openness felt like too much. Days when the lack of clear outlines brought fatigue, a vague desire to be guided by something external, even briefly. In those moments, she let herself feel the desire without acting on it. She had learned not every impulse has to become a decision. Some exist only to reveal needs that can be met in other ways. She began creating small rituals of her own, not rituals of fixation, but of remembering. Simple things, writing her name by hand when she felt scattered, rearranging a space when she noticed she was adapting too much, going for a walk without a destination when life started to feel overly organized. These gestures had no grand symbolic meaning. They functioned as mobile anchors, reminding her that motion didn't have to stop in order to be felt. The memory of the house, now distant, no longer appeared as a closed image but as a quiet comparison. When something started to feel too good, too calm, too stable, she would ask, "Does this ask me for presence or does it ask me for reduction?" The answer rarely came in words. It came as a bodily sensation, a slight tightening or an almost imperceptible expansion. She trusted that more than any promise. She also noticed the world doesn't always punish people immediately for refusing to fit. Sometimes it punishes in subtle ways, missed opportunities, invitations that stop coming, looks that drift away. Once, that would have sparked fear. Now it sparked evaluation. Not every loss is a sign of mistake. Some are simply the natural cost of not folding. In certain environments, she was seen as hard to categorize. She didn't meet expectations easily. She didn't respond on cue. She didn't offer herself up as an emotional solution. That ambiguity pushed some people away and drew others in, and for the first time it didn't bother her. Being hard to read became a form of ethical protection. She began to see how many people spend their lives trying to become understandable in order to secure permanence. simplifying desires, adjusting limits, silencing entire parts of themselves. The house had turned that movement into a system. Outside it, she recognized the same gesture in a smaller, everyday scale, and whenever possible, chose not to collaborate. That didn't make her hard. It made her precise. She knew when to offer warmth and when to step back. She knew when to stay and when to leave before leaving became too painful. That precision wasn't cold, it was self-respect. There were moments when someone tried to draw out in her the old willingness to be central, to occupy a fixed place, to represent something stable in another person's life. She recognized the invitation, felt the brief temptation, and still held her own axis. She didn't have to reject closeness. She only had to make sure closeness didn't demand dissolution. She learned that true intimacy doesn't ask you to exclude the world. It doesn't demand renaming. It doesn't turn care into surveillance. The intimacy worth having accepts the risk of loss because it trusts mutual choice while it exists. As the years passed, that understanding became less conscious and more integrated. She no longer had to analyze it at every step. It worked like an inner sense of direction. When something threatened that sense, her body responded. When something respected it, there was room to stay. By then, the house had become only an extreme example of something much more common, the human urge to control what we love so we won't suffer. She didn't demonize that urge. She simply refused to be its object, and life went on without major narrative milestones, no decisive scenes, no final confrontations, no late revelations, only continuation one day after another. Some good choices, some not so good ones, all made with the awareness that no house, no name, no promise should ever cost her voice. She didn't need to say that out loud anymore. She didn't need to write it. She didn't need to remember it. Her body knew, and as long as it did, as long as she had inner room to step back, step forward, adjust, the story would keep expanding, not as a closed romance, but as a life that allows itself not to fit completely anywhere. That wasn't a lack of belonging. It was belonging to herself, and that, she learned, was the only belonging that never demanded renaming. She began to realize that belonging to herself didn't mean isolation, but a different kind of bond with the world, one not based on total surrender or total withdrawal, but on an ongoing negotiation between closeness and autonomy. That negotiation was no longer exhausting the way it used to be, because it was no longer made under threat. It was made from choice. There were days she wanted to blend more, to let herself be carried by the collective rhythm, to drop the constant attention and simply trust. On some of those days, she allowed herself to, not as surrender, but as experience. She knew she could enter and leave. She knew she didn't have to lose herself to get close. That trust, quiet but firm, was something the house never would have tolerated. She also noticed how her idea of home had changed. Before, home meant permanence, absolute stability, something you don't question. Now home became temporary, a set of conditions, momentary, in which her body relaxes, her mind slows down, and her voice doesn't have to be edited. Sometimes that happened in a physical place, other times in a brief conversation, sometimes in complete solitude. She stopped looking for a final home. She looked for livable moments. That shift deeply changed how she handled other people's expectations. When someone asked where she saw herself in the future, the question no longer produced anxiety. She answered honestly, even if vaguely, not for lack of plans, but because she refused to turn the future into a fixed promise. She knew any overly closed answer carried inside it the seed of another house, and she wasn't willing to build one. Over time, she saw how the world often rewards those who allow themselves to be defined more than those who remain open. Easily classifiable people get clearer paths, more direct invitations, faster belonging. She accepted that cost, not as heroic sacrifice, but as a natural consequence of choosing complexity. Complexity, she learned, is rarely invited to sit at the head table. Still, there were rare encounters, people who recognized the value of that openness without trying to close it. With them, conversation moved without needing an implicit pact. There was no demand for permanence, no fear of change. Those encounters weren't frequent, but they were enough to remind her that choosing not to fit didn't mean absolute solitude. She trusted those rare encounters more than abundant promises. Years later, someone asked if she believed certain people were born to stay. The question was romanticized. She thought for a few seconds before answering. She said she believed some people are born to circulate, and that this isn't failure or avoidance, but a quiet vocation. Not everyone understood that answer, but they didn't need to. She no longer felt responsible for making her life intelligible to anyone who demanded simplification. The clarity that mattered was internal. Everything else could remain ambiguous. If the house still existed somewhere on the physical landscape, it had been returned to what it always was, matter subject to time. Wood that creaks, walls that give, shingles that break, Nothing there survived the refusal of the cycle. And that was just. No structure built to deny endings can resist forever. But what mattered wasn't the house's fate. What mattered was that she no longer needed to imagine it. She didn't need to check whether something was truly over. A real ending doesn't require verification. It announces itself through the absence of a call, and the call had been gone for a long time. She kept living with the calm knowledge that somewhere along the way she had learned something that couldn't be unlearned. Love that demands erasure isn't care, it's fear. And accepting that fear in exchange for comfort costs too much. That knowledge didn't make her immune to pain. It made her less available for unfair trades. She still loved, still attached, still made mistakes. But she did it all without handing her definition over to anyone. Her name didn't need defending anymore, because it was no longer for sale. And so the story kept stretching, not as something that demanded a formal continuation, but as a state of constant motion. A motion that refused a frame, refused to be renamed, refused to be forcibly preserved. As long as there was a world, there would be offers of perfect houses. As long as there was exhaustion, there would be the temptation to step inside. She knew that, and knowing it, she kept choosing, not absolute shelter, not a closed promise, but enough space to breathe, change, and go on, not needing to remain intact, not needing to be stored, not needing to fit, just alive in conscious movement, letting the story continue not as a narrative prison, but as an open road reinvented with every step. She began to accept that living in conscious movement wasn't an exceptional state, but a legitimate form of staying. Staying not in a place, not in a role, not in a fixed name, but in relationship with herself. That kind of staying didn't require external stability. It required only a renewed internal agreement: don't abandon yourself in order to fit. Over time, she saw how many people confuse roots with immobility. They talk about putting down roots as if it means stopping, choosing one patch of ground and accepting everything it demands. She started thinking differently. Roots, for her, became portable, values, limits, bodily listening, the ability to leave when something begins to ask for too much silence. Those roots didn't pin her to the earth. They held her up while she walked. Sometimes it was lonely. Not because there were no presences, but because few people understand the choice not to fully settle. There's a deep social expectation that at some point everyone will land, define themselves, become predictable. She felt that expectation as a light, constant, almost polite pressure, and little by little she learned not to react to it. Not reacting didn't mean resisting with rigidity. It meant not internalizing it, letting the expectation exist without turning it into an inner command. That skill, which once felt impossible, became almost automatic. And it gave her something new, internal space. Inside that space she could see something important. The desire to be preserved, the desire the house had exploited, hadn't vanished completely. It still surfaced in moments of vulnerability, loss, exhaustion. The difference was that now, she recognized it as desire, not truth, a legitimate impulse, but not a reliable guide. Knowing that kept the impulse from becoming blind surrender. She began treating her desires with more gentleness and less obedience. She also learned that not every bond has to be deep in order to be real. Some connections exist only to walk a stretch beside you. Others appear and disappear without leaving lasting marks, and that doesn't make them disposable. The house had promised an eternal bond. Outside it, she discovered the value of temporary bonds that don't try to turn themselves into forever. Those bonds didn't ask for special names or symbols or silent pacts. They existed while they made sense, and when they stopped making sense, they ended without excessive drama. That fluidity, once frightening, became a source of relief. She began to understand that time didn't need to be beaten. The house had tried to do that, to capture a moment, a love, a form, and keep it intact. Outside it, she learned to walk with time, not against it, to accept that everything changes, including her, and that change isn't a threat, it's the condition. There was a specific day, almost banal, when she realized she no longer felt the need to tell her story as something extraordinary. There was no urgency to narrate, explain, contextualize. The story didn't need to be understood by others in order to keep existing. It had done its work by teaching what needed to be learned. That was one of the clearest signs that something had truly ended. She lived now with a quiet trust in her discomfort when it appeared, and an equally quiet acceptance of true rest when it came. She no longer searched for total solutions. She no longer waited for definitive houses. She knew any promise of completeness would demand too high a price. The world kept offering molds, kept suggesting names, kept presenting shelters that promised safety in exchange for adaptation. She hadn't become cynical about it. She had become discerning, and the difference between cynicism and discernment was everything. She didn't reject love. She rejected forced fusion. She didn't reject care. She rejected disguised surveillance. She didn't reject belonging. She rejected erasure. Those distinctions look simple on the surface, but they run deep in practice. They require steady presence. They require daily courage, not the dramatic courage of big scenes, but the quiet courage of sustaining choices that won't always be popular. And she sustained them, so the narrative continued without needing new major events. No final twist was required. The transformation had already happened where it mattered, in the way she placed herself in the world. The rest was consequence. She kept walking, knowing that no story that demands erasure deserves to be continued, knowing that no house that asks for silence in exchange for rest can be home, knowing that no imposed name can replace the living experience of being. And with that knowing carried in her body, not as a rigid rule but as an active sensitivity, she went on, not to arrive, not to remain intact, but to live with enough space to change without getting lost. And as long as that space existed, the story wouldn't need to end. It would simply keep going, open, imperfect, aware, and therefore free enough. She started to notice the freedom she'd earned didn't look like what she'd imagined at the beginning. It wasn't as wide as an open field or as light as a body without gravity. It was closer to a corridor wide enough to walk through without being shoved, space where you can move without being led, but also without the illusion that there are no walls. That realization calmed her. Freedom didn't have to be absolute to be real. With time, she stopped asking whether she was living the right way. She realized that question always hid an external model, an implied blueprint for a successful life. The house had fed on that hunger to get it right. Outside it, she accepted the possibility of living in ways that don't fit exemplary narratives, living sufficiently, not ideally. She began to notice how many people confuse intensity with truth. They believe that if something hurts a lot or promises a lot, it must be important. The house had used that logic. Everything there was intense, heavy, meaningful. Outside it, she discovered the value of what doesn't shout, what doesn't demand constant attention, what doesn't turn every gesture into a symbol. That shift didn't make her less sensitive, it made her harder to capture. She related to silence differently now. Before, silence felt like a warning, space where the house could act. Now silence was just silence, sometimes comfortable, sometimes uncomfortable, but never conspiratorial. That neutrality returned to the world a layer of simplicity she hadn't realized she'd lost. There was a time she believed she needed to forgive in order to move on, to forgive the man, the house, the story. Now she understood forgiveness wasn't essential. What was essential was withdrawing consent. When something stops calling you, forgiveness becomes optional, not as moral achievement, but as practical irrelevance. She learned to withdraw consent not only from people or places, but from inner narratives too, thoughts that insisted on over-explaining, over-justifying, over-accommodating. Each time she caught herself slipping into that motion, she did something simple. She interrupted it. She didn't argue. She just stopped following that line. Repeated over time, that became a form of continuous care. Sometimes she missed having a neat story to tell when someone asked about her life. Honest answers were fragmented, incomplete, hard to summarize, but that stopped bothering her. Not owing anyone a coherent narrative was part of the freedom she'd earned. Life didn't have to fit inside a summary. She also came to see that the house hadn't been only a threat. It was an enlarged mirror of something common, the desire to be relieved of the labor of existing. That desire isn't wrong. It's human. The problem starts when someone offers to take over that labor for you and charges your identity as the price. That clarity made her more ethical in how she related to others. She avoided becoming the center of someone's life, avoided being the solution, avoided becoming the name that replaces other names. When she cared without erasing. When she moved closer, she kept enough space for the other person to remain whole. She discovered this kind of relationship is less common, but far more sustainable. It doesn't create silent dependence. It doesn't require vigilance. It doesn't demand renaming. The house had been built to last beyond what life permits. Outside it, she learned to love what lasts as long as it can, without demanding guarantees, without turning continuity into obligation. Sometimes, walking through old places, she felt a gentle melancholy not aimed at anything specific. It wasn't longing for the house, but an awareness of time, everything that's lost, everything that changes, everything that can't be held. That melancholy didn't paralyze her. It made her more careful with the present. She began living with a restrained kind of gratitude, not for the pain, but for having crossed something hard without letting it become a permanent mold. Many people don't get that chance, not from weakness, but from circumstance. Knowing that made her less proud and more tender toward others. The story no longer needed words to continue. but it still existed as active sensitivity, an attention that doesn't close, a quiet refusal of any invitation that demands erasure. She kept living without expecting to find a definitive place. She knew any place that announced itself as too definitive deserved careful scrutiny. She preferred places you could leave without guilt, relationships that allowed change, names that call rather than bind. And so, without formal closure, without one last symbol, without returning to the point of origin, the narrative remained open, not as a wound, but as a field where she could walk, stop, return, advance, without ever again handing anyone the right to decide who she had to be in order to stay. As long as that field existed inside her, no house could claim her, and that was finally enough. She began to realize that this inner field wasn't constant comfort, but a place where conflict could exist without becoming a cage. There were doubts, contradictions, desires that collided. The difference was that none of it had to be resolved immediately. The house had demanded continuous resolution. Everything needed shape, function, destiny. Outside it, she learned that some questions don't ask for answers. They ask to be lived alongside. Living alongside uncertainty wasn't immediate or gentle. At first, there was an almost automatic urge to organize, define, conclude, as if the lack of form were proof of imminent danger. But over time, she saw the greater danger was the rush to close. Closing meant choosing before listening enough. It meant repeating patterns just to relieve the anxiety of the open. So she gave herself more time to feel before acting, time to watch before deciding, time to admit she didn't know yet. That time, so simple in appearance, was one of her biggest ruptures with everything she had lived. The house couldn't tolerate delay. Delay creates gaps, and gaps are dangerous for any system that depends on constant adhesion. She began to recognize those gaps as places of power. Sometimes, looking back, she felt a nearly philosophical disbelief. How could something that presented itself as absolute protection have felt like love? The answer didn't come as self-accusation, but as structural understanding. The house's promised protection offered immediate rest to someone exhausted from holding herself up, and when rest is rare, it can look like salvation. She no longer blamed herself for believing. Believing in that context had been human. That understanding removed any tone of naivete or personal guilt from the story. The problem had never been believing too much. The problem had been handing too much over to someone who couldn't tolerate loss. She came to think the man's greatest mistake wasn't loving intensely, but trying to keep love from moving through time, turning feeling into system, substituting presence with control, making care into a sealed architecture. Outside the house, she learned that love requires accepting the risk of endings, not as constant tragedy, but as a real possibility. Everything alive can end, and that's exactly why it matters while it exists. That simple, hard truth changed how she stayed in bonds. She stopped promising more than she could sustain. She stopped demanding what she couldn't offer. She stopped using plans as guarantees, treating them instead as intentions that could be revised. It made everything less grand and more real. There were stretches when life felt too small, without big narratives or decisive moments. Once, that would have unsettled her. Now she saw those stretches as balance. The absence of drama meant nothing was trying to capture her. Ordinary daily life became safe not because it was predictable, but because it didn't demand reduction. She felt grateful for things that once would have seemed too banal to notice. Waking up without anticipating danger, entering a space without measuring her behavior, saying no without rehearsing a long justification. Those small gestures were clear proof something essential had changed. The house no longer existed as threat or temptation. It existed only as contrast, a distant reminder of what happens when fear of losing turns into the urge to possess. And that reminder didn't need to be summoned often. It could sit in the background as embodied memory. She also found herself less available to other people's emotional emergencies, not out of coldness, but clarity. She knew not every urgency is legitimate. Some are attempts to offload emotional responsibility. The house had been built on that exact mechanism. Outside it, she refused to carry what wasn't hers. That refusal wasn't aggressive. It was quiet. And quiet, when it isn't imposed, can be a powerful boundary. One day, someone told her, almost as criticism, that she seemed hard to pin down. She heard the phrase with curiosity. She didn't correct it or defend herself. She simply noticed that what once would have been an accusation now sounded like a precise description. Yes, she was hard to pin down. And that wasn't a flaw. She hadn't become unreachable. She had become too whole to fit inside subtle traps. The world kept offering ready stories, closed identities, promises of fast relief. Sometimes she still felt the exhaustion that makes those promises seductive. The difference was that now she recognized exhaustion as a signal to pause, not a reason to surrender. And so the narrative kept expanding almost invisibly, without new symbols, without returning to ruins, without late confrontations. The story no longer needed events, it needed only honest continuation. She went on with calm attention to anything that began to close too tightly, promise too much, demand too much silence, and whenever she recognized that movement, she did something simple and decisive. She stepped back. No drama, no long explanations, no need to prove anything. The house had lost its power because she had learned to recognize early whatever tries to disguise itself as shelter, and as long as that recognition remained, quiet, embodied, undeniable, no story built on erasure would ever be able to claim her again. She continued, not as someone running, not as someone defending herself, but as someone walking, knowing where she doesn't want to stay, and in the end, that was the deepest kind of freedom she knew.